They laughed when Norma Deschamps refused to burn her fields. Not a polite chuckle, not the kind of laugh people give when they're surprised or confused. This was the full, shoulder-shaking, hat-tilting laughter of men who had been farming the same land the same way for 30 years, and could not imagine why a woman who had spent the last decade working as a soil scientist would come back to her father's 400-acre in the Peace River country of northern Alberta and tell them everything they'd been doing was quietly killing the land beneath their feet. Let me tell you about Norma. Norma Deschamps was 53 years old when she came home. Her father, Gilles-Andre Deschamps, had passed in March. A hard winter, a harder man gone quietly, the way that strong people sometimes go, not with drama, but with a kind of tired surrender. He had farmed that land since 1971, canola mostly. Some barley, the same rotation, the same inputs, the same stubble burning in autumn that sent a low gray smoke across the highway every October like clockwork. His neighbors had done it for decades. Their fathers had done it before them. Norma had grown up watching those fires from the school bus window. She had thought, as a child, that the smoke was just part of the season, like the first frost, or the way the sloughs froze over in November. She didn't begin to understand what that smoke actually meant until she was 22 years old, sitting in a soil microbiology lab at the University of Saskatchewan, looking at a cross-section of agricultural topsoil under a microscope and realizing, with the quiet horror of a person who has just understood something they cannot ununderstand, that what she was seeing was mostly dead. She spent the next 3 decades building a career around that moment. She had worked for the provincial government, then for a consulting firm out of Edmonton, then for 2 years as part of a research partnership studying cover crop systems in the Peace River region. She had published papers, she had given presentations at conferences where farmers sat in the back rows with their arms crossed and their faces politely unconvinced. She had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that knowing something true and persuading people of it are 2 entirely different skills. But she had never had to persuade anyone on her own land, not until now. The farm came to her in a will that surprised no one. She was the only one left. Her brother René had moved to Fort McMurray in 1998 and hadn't been back except for funerals. Her mother had passed 8 years earlier, so Norma drove north from Edmonton in early April with 2 boxes of research files in the back seat and a head full of plans she hadn't yet told anyone about. And she took possession of 400 acres of canola country at the exact moment the spring melt was turning the access road into something that looked like a river delta. The first person to come see her was Theodore. No, wait, let me correct that. The first person to come see her was her father's oldest neighbor, a man named Augustin Waller, who had farmed the quarter section to the north for as long as anyone could remember. Augustin was 71, wide through the shoulders, and had a way of standing in a doorway that made every doorway seem slightly too small. He came with a casserole from his wife and a firm handshake and a look on his face that said he had some things to tell her. He sat at the kitchen table and waited while she made coffee, and then he told her, in the measured and not unkind way of a man who believes he is being helpful, that her father had always burned in October, that the co-op had the inputs lined up for the season already, and that if she was planning to seed canola again, she'd want to get on the schedule early, because the certified seed allocation went fast. Norma poured the coffee and sat down across from him and said she was thinking of doing something a little different this year. Augustin looked at her over the rim of his mug. Different, he said, like the word tasted unfamiliar. She told him she was planning to put in a multi-species cover crop blend after the first cut: oats, hairy vetch, phacelia, turnip, maybe some winter rye, and she was not going to burn the residue in the fall. She was going to roll it and leave it on the soil surface. Augustine was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, that the county had been dealing with clubroot and canola, and that leaving residue on the surface was the kind of thing that could cause problems she didn't want. She said she understood clubroot. She said she had a rotation plan that would manage the risk. She said the cover crop blend was specifically chosen to break disease cycles, not encourage them. He looked at her the way people look at someone who has just explained why the sky is actually green, respectful, patient, completely unconvinced. He finished his coffee. He thanked her for it. He said if she needed anything, she knew where to find him. And on his way out the door, he paused and said, gently, that her father had always kept good land, and he hoped she'd be able to do the same. She understood exactly what he meant. The next few weeks were a tutorial in how fast information travels in a rural municipality. She hadn't told more than 3 people about her plans before the whole of the coffee row at the Grimshaw Co-op apparently knew that Gilles-André's daughter was back from the city with some kind of university scheme involving weeds and no burning. She heard this secondhand from the woman at the hardware store, who told her with a sympathetic smile that people were just curious. People were not just curious. At the first municipal agricultural meeting she attended in May, she sat near the back and listened to 40 minutes of business before the floor opened for discussion. An agrologist from the county named Darrell Fick, the kind of man who had worn the same style of cap since 1987 and considered this a form of consistency, stood up and addressed the room generally, though his eyes found Norma's corner of it without much difficulty, and said there had been some concern about management practices on certain quarter sections that might present risks to neighboring operations in terms of weed pressure and disease vectors. The room did not laugh, but it did go very still in a way that amounted to the same thing. Norma did not stand up. She wrote down what Darrell Fick said, and she wrote down the names of the 2 men who added their support for his concern, and she drove home and sat at her kitchen table for a long time looking at the fields through the window. Have you ever been told by someone with a title and a podium that your knowledge doesn't count because you got it from books instead of from a field? Have you ever been in a room where the silence directed at you was louder than anything being said out loud? Then you know something of what Norma felt that night. But here is what you need to understand about Norma Deschamps. She had spent 23 years in rooms where people with more authority and less data argued confidently about soil systems they had never looked at closely. She had learned to be very, very patient with this. She had also learned to keep excellent records. She seeded her cash crop in late May, a certified canola variety with a clubroot-resistant rating she had selected deliberately. Behind it, in a second pass in late June, she put in her cover crop blend: oats at 12 pounds per acre, hairy vetch at 6, phacelia at 2, turnip at 1.5, and winter rye at 8. She had calculated the blend herself, based on research out of Manitoba and her own field trials from her consulting years. The oats would terminate in the frost. The vetch would fix nitrogen. The phacelia would pull pollinators. The turnip would break up the shallow compaction layer her father's equipment had been building for a decade. The rye would hold the snow. It was, in her estimation, a reasonable and scientifically defensible plan. Her neighbor to the east, a younger man named Owen Tate, who had taken over his family's operation 3 years earlier, came by in July to look at what was happening in her fields. He stood at the edge of the road allowance and looked at the rows of canola interspersed with the early green haze of the cover crop establishing underneath, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said it looked like a lot going on. Norma agreed that it was. Owen asked if she was worried about the vetch climbing the canola stems. She said she'd timed it to avoid that. She said the vetch wouldn't really take off until the canola was into pod set. He looked at the field for another moment. Then he said, not unkindly, that he'd heard she wasn't planning to burn in the fall. She said that was right. He nodded slowly. He was a careful man, Owen. The kind of farmer who read the Canola Digest cover to cover and kept his equipment immaculately maintained. He wasn't dismissive. He was genuinely concerned, and she could tell the difference. She told him the residue management plan. She told him about the roller she'd borrowed from a colleague in Fairview. She told him about the soil temperature data she was collecting weekly with sensors she'd put in at 3 different depths. He listened. He didn't commit to anything, but he listened. That was in July. In August, the weather changed. Peace River country is not a place that gives you gentle summers. It is a place of late frosts and early frosts, and the particular anxiety of a short growing season where every week matters. But the summer of that year was something different. The rain stopped in the second week of July and didn't come back. The forecast kept showing systems that turned north or broke apart before they arrived. By mid-August, the county was in what the regional agrologist's office carefully called abnormal dryness, and what the farmers were calling, in rather more direct terms, a drought. Norma watched it happen with the particular attention of someone who has been waiting, without wanting to be right, for a test. The canola on her land was ahead of schedule. The cover crop had been competing for moisture in the early weeks, which had stressed her more than she let on, but by late July the canola was podded, and the cover crop was providing ground shade that the bare soil fields around her were missing entirely. She checked her soil moisture sensors every morning. The numbers were not good, but they were better than what she was seeing in the fields across the road. She drove past Augustin Waller's North Quarter in the third week of August and pulled over and looked at his canola. It was swathed early. Too early, she thought. But when there's no moisture left in the soil and the pods are at risk, you cut your losses and pray the windrows dry down evenly. His field was bleached and pale, the residue already curling in the heat. Her field was still standing. Not triumphantly, she was not a person given to that kind of narrative, but standing. She put the swather in on August 28th, 4 days later than Augustin, and the yield monitor told a story she had to read twice to believe. Her canola came in at 42 bushels per acre. The county average that year, as she would learn later from the crop insurance office, was 31. Let me stop here and ask you something. When you've been told you're wrong, not gently, not privately, but in a room full of people, and then the evidence comes in and the evidence says, you were right. What do you do with that? Do you make sure people know? Do you go back to that room and stand up at the front of it? Do you call the man with the cap who looked past you in May? Norma Deschamps did not do any of those things. She called the crop insurance office and filed her production report. She called her seed supplier and ordered her inputs for next year. She walked her fields after the swather went through and took soil samples from 17 locations, bagged them, labeled them, and sent them to the lab. Then she sat on the tailgate of her truck at the edge of the east field in the September evening light, with the rolled cover crop residue lying across the stubble in long gray windrows, and she ate a sandwich and watched the sky go red over the river valley, and she thought about her father. Gilles-André Deschamps had not been a man who talked much about the land in any philosophical sense. He had talked about prices and inputs and weather and equipment. He had talked about what things cost and what things earned. But once, when Norma was maybe 12 years old, She had found him standing at the end of the south field at dusk, just standing there, doing nothing, which was so unusual for him that she had stopped and watched from a distance. He stood for a long time. Then he bent down and picked up a handful of soil and held it and let it run through his fingers, and then he walked back toward the house. She had never asked him what he was thinking. She wished now that she had. The soil samples came back in October. The organic matter in her fields was already measurably higher than the county baseline from 2 years prior. Not dramatically. One season cannot undo 30 years, but the trajectory was there. The fungal networks in her samples were active. The earthworm counts at her 3 sensor sites were up from the spring baseline she'd collected in April. The land was beginning to wake up. Darrell Fick did not come to her with an apology. She had not expected him to, but in November she got a phone call from the county's Agricultural Extension Office asking if she would be willing to speak at the Winter Ag meeting about her cover crop management system. She said she would be willing to do that. And then in December, Owen Tate knocked on her door. He came in the early evening, after feeding, still in his coveralls. He accepted coffee and sat at the table in the same chair Augustin Waller had sat in back in April, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that careful people are quiet when they are building up to something. He said his yield had been 28 bushels. He said he'd lost about 15% on his most exposed quarter, the one with the sandy knolls, where the topsoil was thinnest. He said he'd been looking at her numbers, which she'd shared in the county crop report summary, and he had some questions. She answered every one of them. He stayed for 2 hours. He had a notebook. He wrote things down. Before he left, he stood in the doorway, not filling it the way Augustin did, but standing there with his cap in his hands, and he said, and she would remember the exact words because she wrote them down afterward, "I should have asked you more questions in July." She said she was glad he was asking them now. After he left, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the fields under the first light snow of December, the cover crop residue holding the surface, the soil underneath doing things that wouldn't be visible, building structure, cycling carbon, slowly remaking itself into something that could hold water the next time the rain didn't come. There is a line in the soil science literature that Norma had quoted in 3 different papers over the years. It goes like this: the soil is not a medium for plant growth. It is a living system that produces plant growth as a byproduct of its own health. She had said it in conference rooms and extension offices and university classrooms for 20 years. Nobody had ever put it on a slide. Nobody had ever written it down. Owen Tate wrote it down in his notebook in her kitchen in December. The Winter Ag meeting was held in February at the community hall in Grimshaw. Norma drove through a light snow to get there. The hall held about 60 people, and there were close to 80 chairs pulled out. She had been told she'd have 30 minutes. She took 45. She showed the yield data. She showed the soil sample comparisons. She showed the moisture sensor readings from July and August, charted against the county average for that period. She showed photographs of her fields in mid-August, standing against photographs she had taken of comparable fields that had been swathed 2 weeks early. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say, "Some of you told me I was wrong." She did not mention the municipal meeting in May or the man with the cap who had looked past her in the room. She said, "Here is what I did, and here is what happened, and here is what I think it means for next year." Darrell Fick asked 2 questions during the Q&A. Both of them were technical. She answered both of them directly and completely. Augustin Waller sat in the 3rd row and did not say anything during the Q&A. But at the end, When people were putting on their coats and picking up their coffee cups, he came to the front of the room and stood in front of her and extended his hand and said, "Your father would have liked to see that." She shook his hand and thanked him. She drove home in the dark, with the heater running and the radio on low, through the snow and the spruce and the long flat miles of the Peace River country in February, and she thought, spring is coming. She thought, there's a lot of work to do. She thought about the South Quarter, where she wanted to try a different cover blend next year. More legumes, less cereal. She thought about the compaction layer on the northeast corner that the turnip roots hadn't quite reached. She thought about the grant application she had been drafting for a 3-year study on no-burn residue management in northern Alberta, and whether the County Ag Committee would co-sign it now. She thought about her father standing at the end of the field at dusk, letting the soil run through his fingers. She thought, I know what he was thinking. Some things take 30 years to understand. Some things take a drought. Some things take a woman who drove north from Edmonton with 2 boxes of files and a plan she had not told anyone about, and who stood in a room full of people who had already decided what they knew and did not argue with them, and went home and put sensors in the ground and waited for the evidence to speak in the only language that farming actually understands. The language of what survives. I keep thinking about the moment Norma bent down in that empty field in April. Not to plant anything, not to fix anything, just to pick up a handful of her father's soil and feel what was actually there. That image stays with me because it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, and I think the quietest moments are often where the real decisions get made. What Norma did wasn't luck. It wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. There's a kind of logic running underneath her whole story, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. She knew what she knew. Not because she was handed it, but because she had spent 23 years earning it, sitting with data that other people dismissed, standing in rooms where her voice was the one most easily overlooked, and choosing every single time to go back to the evidence instead of to the argument. That's not a small thing. That takes something in a person that doesn't come automatically. I think about the version of Norma who could have walked into that first meeting with Augustine and led with her credentials, who could have stood up at the municipal ag meeting and corrected Darrell Fick in front of the room, who could have waited for Owen's December visit with a prepared list of her own told-you-sos. She didn't do any of that, not because she lacked confidence, but because she understood that being right and being useful are not always the same thing, and she cared more about the second one. That kind of restraint, choosing to show instead of argue, to demonstrate instead of debate, is a form of integrity that I find genuinely hard to practice and genuinely worth trying for. And then there's what she actually knew. The science, the soil microbiology, the cover crop timing, the compaction layer that turnip roots could reach where machinery couldn't. None of that knowledge came from sitting still. It came from years of paying close attention to things that most people treated as background. There's something in that worth sitting with, the idea that real understanding isn't about having access to information, it's about caring enough to look at it carefully, for long enough even when no one is watching and no one is asking you to. What I find hardest in Norma's story, and maybe the most honest part, is the waiting. The summer when the rain stopped and the sensors showed numbers that were not good. The moment you know the test is coming and you cannot speed up the result. Most of us want to be proven right before the drought hits, not during it. Most of us want some signal, before we've committed, that the risk we're taking is actually going to pay off. Norma didn't get that signal. She put the sensors in the ground, and she waited, and she kept working. And that kind of sustained effort in the absence of reassurance is, I think, the hardest thing to learn and the most necessary. Her father let soil run through his fingers at the end of a field at dusk and said nothing. She spent 30 years figuring out what he meant. I'm not sure I'll ever fully earn that kind of knowledge, but I think trying for it carefully, honestly, stubbornly, is probably the point.